am delighted to be joined today by the composer Julian Anderson. His music has been played the world over, including performances by the Berlin Phil, London Symphony Orchestra, English National Opera, and the New York Philharmonic. He also has quite a standing in education. He was head of department at the Royal College of Music, his alma mater, senior professor of composition at Harvard, and now senior professor of composition and composer in residence at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. He was awarded a CBE in 2021 for services to music, and also in 2022 he became only the fourth British composer to receive the Graumeyer Award for his cello concerto, Litanies. Julian began his formal studies at the Royal College of Music as an undergraduate, but then he came to Cambridge for the MPhil, where he studied with Alexander Goer. So, Julian, welcome. And could you tell me, if thinking back to your time becoming a student at Cambridge, do you have a first distinct memory of Cambridge?
Well, I remember my interview with Alexander Goer at Trinity Hall because he was very, very welcoming. He had a formidable reputation as a very erudite man. He was a common speaker on the radio. He'd given the Wreath Lectures just a couple of years before that, and I'd heard him talking on modern music and society in the late 70s as a kid. I read him, heard his music, and thought of him as a pretty formidable character. So I wasn't expecting such a warm personality, which is what I got. It was a nice sunny afternoon, and he welcomed me into those rooms. He was very complimentary, not about my music, but about my musical technique. He said I'd been very well trained, which I later realized was very high praise from him indeed. He didn't usually say much like that. He quizzed me about everything under the sun, not just music. It was a really interesting interview. One of two interviews I can remember in my life. The other was with Jonathan Harvey, where so much of about existence, as well as just music and notes, was sort of seamlessly blended one into the other. So I left Walking on Air just because it had been such an exciting interview. And he then said, well, you can come here if you want, which I thought was rather sweet. And I didn't hesitate. As it happens, my very much beloved previous composition teacher, John Lambert, had not been friendly with Alexander Goer and had he was a super teacher, John, but he had a lot of reservations about me going to Cambridge. But I'd been with John 5 years, and in a sense doing something John didn't want me to do was part of the agenda in going to Sandy. But it was really because that interview was so fantastic and was so wide-ranging.
Mm-hmm. What was the pull to coming to Cambridge if your previous teacher wasn't necessarily that friendly with Sandy?
I needed to get more perspective on London music scene, which was in those days extremely active and very hyper. I had got into Cambridge in 86 to start in 87, and the Royal College of Music both, and had enormous difficulty working out which I wanted to do, and finally chose the Royal College. Which meant that I'd spent my entire undergraduate time in London, going to concerts, going to lectures, going to seminars, going to everything, art galleries, films, the work of what London can offer culturally, museums, fantastic. And I felt I needed a bit of a break from all that to sort of get perspective on it also as a composer. And so it was that. Also, I had some kind of fantasy that when you turned up in Cambridge, you'd immediately, as a postgraduate student, be mixing with scientists and philosophers and of your own generation. And so that's actually not what happens. Or maybe it is now. But at that time, this is the early 90s, what happened was that there was very sectarian seating in the dining halls, and the singers or choral scholars sat at one area and the philosophers in another area and so on. And you didn't really get... I think I met one philosopher in the whole of my time, and that was somebody I happened to have been at school with. I mean, that didn't... of course, much later, High Table does offer that experience.
Yeah.
But the undergraduate and postgraduate population did not in those days mingle in their topics at all.
Okay.
It was very, very difficult to break in to that. So there was part of that. and it was Sandy. It was Alexander Gurr. He was everyone knew him as Sandy. He was a very stimulating mind, and there was also still teaching then Robin Holloway, who I didn't formally study with, but who offered open house at his place.
You mentioned Cambridge providing a bit of distance or perspective from a very kind of orgo atmosphere that you'd experienced beforehand. That's something that really resonates with me as well from a conservatoire background coming here. I wanted to find that distance and that almost an opportunity to really figure out what my daily life might look like as a composer and have that breath. So thinking in that time and what your daily life might have looked like in the study and trying to figure out and carve out what life might be like for you as a composer, is there anything particular that you took from that time that really carved its way into how you went on to compose?
Well, it's an interesting question you asked, because in fact for much of my time in Cambridge I could not compose. I had started an orchestral work of some size and I dried up, and in fact it was written very quickly towards the end of my MPhil course. It was very difficult to get it written indeed, and I was blocked for most of my time. I think in my case it was being confronted with a number of very, very gifted musicians of my own generation. I had, of course, mingled with gifted musicians at the Royal College of Music, but there were far fewer composers at that time, and we were a rather disparate lot. We didn't know what each other were up to very much. In Cambridge, on the other hand, I encountered a number of very gifted composers and performers who were very, very high-powered indeed, and I began to doubt that I could actually do it. I think most composers worth their salt have been through periods where they were worried that they couldn't actually do it anymore. And if you've not been through that, I think it's worrying that you haven't. I'm very active in teaching composition. Now it's one of the main ways, aside from composing, that I've spent my time professionally. And I think if I have any skills as a teacher of composition, it may be because I know what it's like and remember very vividly what it's like to be unable to produce the music you want to write, and can even at times hear bits of in your head, but you cannot get it out. You cannot get it onto paper properly. You can't organize the thoughts properly. You can't work out how this is going to work, so that when it finally did start to work, I was slightly incredulous that it was working at all. I suppose I still am. And you've got, I think, as a teacher, to be very sympathetic to the students' vulnerability creatively. And that was something about which Sandy Gurr was very sympathetic, because he always had doubts about his own creativity, enormous ones, by the way. And occasionally would say to me, do you know, the thing is, you seem to have a decent ear musically. I've always thought my ear isn't good enough to be a composer. I mean, he, in his generation, he mingled with people like Pierre Boulez, who had a phenomenal ear, and who would just look at a score and hear it and so on. And Sandy couldn't do that, and he felt very intimidated by that. I think also by his conductor father's musical expertise. And he said to me at one point, my imagination is intellectual primarily, not oral. I regret that, but there's nothing else I can do. And I said, listening to the best of your music, I didn't say the best, listening to your music, I don't think that's true. So you weren't dealing with somebody who was phenomenally intimidating. And I think it's very important for a teacher, whatever their musical interests, not to intimidate the student, but to encourage the student.
It sounds very like a really human response, very kind response. So you've taken that forward from in your teaching?
Yes. I was at that time, and I'm kind of proud of this, one of the very first British composers to have been very strongly influenced by and knowledgeable about what we now call spectral music, which was a thing that started in a mixture of France and Germany, mainly in the 70s, reaction against Serism. But what it was basically studying sound and the nature of sound and trying to proceed from there as a composer. And that appealed to me very much, because I felt that a lot of contemporary music of that period didn't pay attention to sound, and here was music that clearly sounded very, very good and did. But it wasn't at that time known in Britain, and I had to go over to France to study it in those pre-internet days, you see. And so I had a lot of technical equipment of that sort. And Gurr didn't know about it, but wanted to know. He just was curious to know what this was. So I explained. And as I'd also already done to my previous teacher, John Lambert, funnily enough, their response was quite similar, which was that they were curious. But they kept saying, why? I'd say, well, do this, and then you do that, and you do this way, and do that. Yes, but why? And I couldn't answer that question. And I thought, why? Why? And the point was that what I was beginning to realize was that that wasn't going to be what I was going to do as a composer. It was influenced me a very great deal to this day, but it wasn't going to be the basis of what I did, the starting point at all, that it wouldn't suit me. And that was also one of the other reasons, surely, that I was finding it difficult to make progress as a composer, because I felt very sectarian about this, that one should be doing this. I thought this was the future of music and all that nonsense. Yeah, well, one has those illusions age 22 or something. And it wasn't.
Yeah.
And for me, that breaking free of that was terribly important. And Gurr's openness as a teacher helped me do that. I don't want to make this sound too removed from the real world, though, because Sandy was very left-wing, and he was very concerned with the role of music in society, and he also forced me to think a lot about that. All of these things are things I've taken forward in what I do.
But you also have a real place in choral music.
To my surprise, yeah.
You mentioned choirs briefly earlier and the dinner tables and segregation. Did you sing when you were here?
No. The only thing I sang was I was at Gonville and Keyes as a postgraduate. Then I came back, I should explain. I did come back to start a doctorate in musicology at King's, of which I did 2 years. And Sandy had warned, I was also with Gurr, and Sandy had warned me that I probably wouldn't complete because I was getting busy as a composer, and that proved accurate. But they were 2 very well-spent years, nevertheless. I sang in the King's College May Week concert where we did twice. We did Beethoven's Ninth under Stephen Kleber. In the following year, we did the Symphony of Psalms, and that was the only singing I did at that time. My singing days date from when I was in my late 30s. I joined the London Philharmonic Choir in 2005, I think I joined it, and I stayed till 2012. And that was simply because I had 2 commissions coming up involving chorus and orchestra, and I didn't know how that worked. And I had friends in the choir, and they said, well, why don't you join? Which seemed a slightly bizarre idea, but I passed the audition in spite of having this awful voice. And I then got hooked.
Okay. And
I got addicted to singing in choir. And the very first gig I did was The Dream of Gerontius, which was under Mark Elder, Sir Mark Elder, in Manchester at Bridgewater Hall, and then the following night live on BBC Two at the Proms. And incidentally, I realised halfway through the second part, which is actually quite quiet, that I'd left my mobile phone on, and it was in my pocket. And I was desperately trying to, my neighbours trying to stop me moving. Shut up. And I was trying to turn this damn thing off, and I didn't manage it. Thank God it didn't go off, because that would have been the end of my singing in that choir if it had live on BBC Two, for God's sake. When you're doing this day in, day out for 7 years, things go in, and that got me writing other choral music. But yeah, I've done a lot of choral music, and I very, very much enjoy it, because when you're writing choral music, you're writing for people who really love music and who really love the physical act of singing it and who need it. So for me, it was about getting inside music. I think composers too often are observing music rather than actually physically being inside it. I think composers should sing much more than they do. It was a delight to find me in my late 30s I could become a performer again.
Yeah.
And that also relates to something that's happening now with me, which is I'm beginning to conduct more.
Okay.
And that comes directly out of years of watching conductors in that choir and learning how they do what they do, and sometimes, if I may be perfectly honest, sometimes how they don't. Because you learn very quickly as a singer who, and I'm sure you've seen this, which conductor is going to be helpful, how, and which isn't. I can name one immediately. The first one I sang under Sir Mark Elder. from the very first time I was in a piano rehearsal under him, it was perfectly obvious that he knew our choral parts better than we did, and we'd been singing very little else for 6 weeks.
So when you were a student in Cambridge, you talked earlier about these different tables and the choirs and everyone singing, and those students aren't necessarily always musos as well. They're not necessarily music students. They come from wherever. So you've got this really incredible breadth and depth of musicality within the university. What was your relationship to concert life and events and things like that in Cambridge at that time?
Well, at that time, I was very concerned that the student compositions weren't being played very much, which I know has changed considerably now, very majorly changed. But at that time, they weren't. And so I put together a new music festival in February 1991, which festival was rather a grand name for something that only had 4 concerts in it. Mind you, they were substantial. Tom Addis, who was an undergraduate, wrote his Chamber Symphony Op. 2 for one of the concerts which he conducted. I conducted another concert, and the third concert had Nick Hodges, who was a wonderful pianist and still is, playing a recital, I think, of Michael Finnessy and himself. I forget who. And the fourth concert involved Kings, actually, because it had Trois Petites Liturgies of Messiaen, which actually hadn't been played in Cambridge before. And I knew an Martineau player from Switzerland who we were able to fly over. And so Tom Addis played the piano in that. That was just the day after his Chamber Symphony was premiered, and we did Trois Petites Liturgies in Kings. So that was all sort of part of the same sort of event. And putting on events like that, I think, is very, very good when you're a student to learn about the craft of practical matters like staging, where you put instrumentalists, how much rehearsal time such and such needs, etc., etc. And we were very lucky that at least one of the pieces premiered in that festival, Tom Addis's Chamber Symphony, was a major discovery, and that got him published. That was a very major achievement on the part of all the students involved. Mr. Addis, myself, Nick Hodges and so on. These were all very, very lively people to be around, and putting on that taught me really a great deal, because I think it's all very well saying, if you're not happy with the situation, that's fine, but you must do something about it. And what's great about people like, say, Britten or Pierre Boulez, Judith Weir, other people, is that they've actually gone out there and made a difference and done something to improve a situation. That's very important in real life. So that was a major thing for me to organise that, because there seemed to be a lack of something here, and then to learn from that and apply that lesson to life outside. Yeah.
To close up, thinking of your fond, happy memories as a student, but also maybe in how your relationship has continued with Cambridge, your encounters of Cambridge. So a quick fire round about your favourite places in Cambridge, past or present. So first one, favourite place for thinking.
Well, I'm not really allowed in unless I know somebody in the college, but Trinity Gardens.
Okay.
I find those absolutely beautiful. And if I know somebody, as I sometimes do, in that college and they take me into the gardens, I love thinking there.
Favourite place for walking?
Oh, the backs.
Mm-hmm.
Rather cliched, but you know.
Do you have a favourite place along the backs?
Nah.
No, just a nice...
It's nice. It's nice if there are punters punting and things like that going on. Yeah.
Favourite place for eating?
Well, as a student, it was Gardenia's, which is, I don't know if it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I liked that very much, but that's a long time ago.
Was it still a late night?
Yeah, you
off?
could get sort of pita bread filled with
yeah. Still
at like 3 a.m. or something, yeah.
Thank you so much, Julian, for joining us. And,
great pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Well, be sure to tune in to the future podcasts as they emerge. Thank you very much for joining us in Cambridge.